when we look at Acts chapter 3 and verse 25, look at what Peter said on the day of Pentecost. Just for context, just to see who he was speaking to, verse 12 tells us, and when Peter saw it, he addressed the people, men of Israel. So Peter was speaking to Israelites, these same people whom Paul wrote that he was frustrated with. He's in anguish with. Okay? So verse 25 is continued there. He says, You men of Israel, are the sons of the prophets and of the covenant that God made with your fathers, the fathers of Israel, the patriarchs, saying to Abraham, and in your offspring or in your seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. So remember, we are talking about those through whom the seed came and those to whom the seed came. So in a certain sense, the descendants of Israel were those through whom the seed came, and as well, in a certain sense, Israel was those to whom the seed came as well. Because he says, you are the sons of the prophets and of the covenant that God made with your fathers, saying to Abraham, and in your offspring, that is in Abraham's offspring, shall the families of the earth be blessed, because it is through Abraham's physical line the seed came. It is through that line. But also, in terms of to whom that seed came, Paul is going to make some distinctions, some very, very important distinctions. But he said, so God, having raised up his servant, that is Christ, sent him to you first, to bless you by turning every one of you from your wickedness. This is why Paul was being frustrated, because he understood these people were through whom the seed came and to whom the seed came. And if we go into Acts chapter 13 and read verse 32, he says there, and we bring you the good news that what God promised to the fathers, again, right? That this he has fulfilled. So the time had come, in the time of the apostles, the time had come where that promised seed had come. It had been fulfilled. He has fulfilled what he had promised to the fathers by raising Jesus, as it is also written in the second Psalm, you are my son, today I have begotten you. So the promise to the fathers was fulfilled by the raising of Jesus. That means, in thy seed shall all the earth be blessed. Well, that seed had come, and when God raised Jesus from the dead, it was fulfilled. So in verse 6, as we go back to Romans 9, in verse 6, Paul continues, but it is not as though the word of God has failed. So in other words, even though Paul was in anguish about Israel's seeming lack of acceptance of the promised seed, which is Christ, in fact, Paul also went on to say that what was happening in Paul's time was actually what God in his foreknowledge had already predicted. So while it seemed as if Israel, by and large, had rejected the promise, had rejected the seed, had rejected the Christ, had broken the promise, had disqualified themselves from the adoption, being sons of God. In fact, the truth was that what was happening at that time was supposed to happen initially. Israel was supposed to initially abandon Christ. Christ was supposed to be rejected so that God could show his mercy. And secondly, Paul goes on to say in this statement here, for not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. Notice, he said, it is not as though the word of God has failed, for reason being. In other words, the word of God actually predicted that not all who are descended from Israel belong to Israel. That's already, he said, that's already in the word of God. Even though those to whom and through whom the seed came were rejecting it, and by doing that were breaking themselves off from the covenant of with God, Paul says that doesn't mean the word of God is failed. It actually proves the word of God true, because the word of God had already predicted that. God, through his prophets, had already said this is what will happen. So he says, So he begins to explain now the principle of the divine selection, or some Bibles would call election. Election. Same thing. The process of God choosing men to establish his seed covenant with. Paul's understanding was that the true Israel were those descendants of Jacob whom God had chosen to receive Christ. Those who had rejected Christ and who had continued in that rejection, they were not the elect. They were not God's election. But those who, even though initially they had rejected Christ, which they were prophesied to do, but who, after that initial rejection, had repented and subsequently accepted Christ and received mercy from God, those were the elect.